So you take an army of 134,000 well-fed, logistically supported troops.
Right, a massive force.
Exactly, of a massive force. And you pit them against a half-starved, ragged army of maybe 60,000. I mean, standard mathematical doctrine points to a pretty inevitable victor there.
Oh, without a doubt. On paper, it's a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, but if you transpose that equation into the dense, tangled scrub of the Virginian wilderness in the spring of 1863, that math just completely shatters.
It really does. It's a fascinating inversion of reality.
It is, and that's what we're looking at today. We are analyzing how a massively outnumbered army managed to structurally paralyze and honestly just dismantle a vastly superior force.
Yeah, and to really understand how that happened, you have to look beyond the basic maps.
Right. And to do that, our roadmap for you today is this incredibly rigorous research study by Mick Prichter at battlefieldtravels.com. This analysis leverages deep primary source accounts, firsthand battlefield exploration, and some really advanced GIS terrain modeling.
Which is an absolute requirement for Chancellorsville, by the way. I mean, if you examine this campaign through the lens of just a two-dimensional map, the Union defeat is basically incomprehensible.
Makes zero sense.
Zero. You really have to synthesize the psychological weight pressing down on the command structures with the brutal, blinding reality of the local microterrain.
Yeah, absolutely. So the objective here is to dissect the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was fought from the 27th of April through the 6th of May, 1863.
A really intense window of time.
Super intense. We're going to explore the...
Right, and contrast that with the hardened, almost fanatical state of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia.
Exactly. So where was the Union Army mentally at this point?
Well, you have to view the Army of the Potomac in January 1863 as an organization suffering from profound systemic shock. I mean, they had endured the Peninsula Campaign's strategic failures, the tactical beating at Second Manassas.
And a bloodletting at Antietam?
Yeah, exactly. But the true institutional anchor weighing them down was Fredericksburg.
Oh, man, Fredericksburg. That was December 1862, right? General Ambrose Burnside throws his men against the Stonewall at Marye's Heights.
A total disaster.
It really was. We are talking about nearly 13,000 Union casualties against maybe 5,000 Confederate losses. And for what? Zero strategic gain.
Nothing. And if you read the primary source diaries from that winter, the soldiers aren't just feeling defeated. They are profoundly cynical about their own high command.
I can imagine. Burnside fundamentally broke the social contract between the commander and the rank and file, didn't he?
He absolutely did. You know, a soldier will endure terrible conditions and heavy fire if they believe there is a strategic purpose to it.
Right, if there's an actual goal.
Exactly. But at Fredericksburg, they were marched into an obvious, mechanically predictable meat grinder. I mean, the aftermath was an army just dissolving from within.
The desertion rates were insane.
Right? Catastrophic. The desertion rates in the winter camps around Falmouth were sky high. Disease was rampant due to horrific sanitation. And the political fallout in Washington was incredibly corrosive.
Right, because Lincoln was facing immense pressure from the radical Republicans in Congress. The press was hostile, and he was desperately cycling through commanders. He needed someone who had a synthesis of administrative competence and battlefield aggression.
Which brings us to the appointment of Major General Joseph Hooker.
Yes, Fighting Joe Hooker. I find Lincoln's letter of appointment to Hooker to be a masterclass in executive communication.
Oh, it's brilliant.
He acknowledges Hooker's bravery, but he explicitly calls him out for actively subverting his previous commanders. He effectively tells them, look, I'm giving you this command despite your insubordination because I need your aggression.
What's fascinating here is how Lincoln, despite his lack of formal military background, perfectly diagnosed the specific medicine the Army of the Potomac required at that exact moment.
Yeah, he knew exactly what was needed.
Right. I mean, Hooker's political maneuvering and toxic ambition were immense liabilities, sure, but his administrative brilliance was undeniable. He didn't just assume command, he executed a total corporate restructuring of the Army.
Let's get into the mechanics of that restructuring, because the source material highlights this as the foundation of the entire Chancellorsville campaign. He targets the supply chain and camp logistics first.
He had to. You cannot maneuver a sick, starving army. Hooker overhauled the commissary system entirely. He ensured fresh bread and vegetables actually reached the front lines.
Which effectively halted the scurvy that was creeping through the winter camps.
Exactly. He instituted rigorous sanitation inspections, too. And maybe most importantly, he regularized the furlough system.
Oh, wow. Did that help with the desertions?
Instantly. It instantly dropped the desertion rate because the men finally had a legal, predictable way to go home and then return. He also introduced corps badges, which was a brilliant psychological tool. It fostered fierce unit cohesion and pride.
That's a great point, but the most lethal reform, at least tactically, was his reorganization of the cavalry, wasn't it?
Oh, without question. Prior to Hooker, the Union cavalry was completely decentralized. They were attached in these small brigades to infantry corps.
So they were basically acting as glorified pickets and messengers.
Exactly. But Hooker consolidates them into a unified, massed cavalry corps. By centralizing the cavalry, he created a strategic intelligence apparatus and a massive mobile strike force.
Wow.
He upgraded the Union Army from having scattered security cameras to possessing a unified long-range radar system. This centralization fundamentally altered their reconnaissance capabilities.
That is a massive shift. So the aggregate result is that by April 1863, Hooker commands an absolute juggernaut, 134,000 men. They are healthy, they're highly disciplined, fiercely loyal to him, and fully equipped.
A completely transformed fighting force.
Right, now contrast that with what is sitting directly across the Rappahannock River. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lee is fielding just 60,000 men.
And those 60,000 are in a state of severe logistical deprivation. I mean, the Confederate supply lines from Richmond were archaic, and they were failing.
The troops were chronically short of footwear, right?
Yeah, shoes, their uniforms were rotting off their backs, and their daily ration was bordering on actual starvation levels.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, Lee's numerical disadvantage was exacerbated by the absence of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps. They had been detached to Suffolk, Virginia, to secure vital forage and guard against coastal threats.
So Lee is literally missing a massive portion of his heavy infantry. He is outnumbered more than 2-to-1. Yet, according to Mick Prichter's research, Confederate morale was dangerously high. How do you reconcile a starving, outnumbered army with peak combat morale?
Well, it comes down to the psychology of leadership. They had this deep-seated belief in their own tactical superiority. Fredericksburg had cemented this aura of invincibility around Lee.
Right, they trusted him completely.
Exactly. His men had internalized the belief that their command structure, Lee, backed by Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Cavalry Commander J.E.B. Stuart, was simply outthinking the Union High Command at every single turn.
So they felt like they couldn't lose.
Pretty much. They had a hardened core of veteran infantry who believed that if Lee put them on a piece of ground, they could hold it against any numerical odds.
See, I still struggle with the geometry of Lee's defensive posture here. As a commander facing a 134,000-man force with deep supply lines, while your own men are starving. Standard doctrine dictates a retrograde movement.
You fall.
Right. You fall back toward Richmond, you shorten your lines of communication, and you look for highly defensible terrain to force the Union into another Mares Heights scenario. Standing your ground at Fredericksburg against those odds, it's like a besieged garrison throwing open the gates to attack the siege engines directly.
It sounds insane, but a retrograde movement surrenders the initiative. It allows the superior force to dictate the tempo of the campaign.
I see.
Lee understood that a passive defense against Hooker's logistical machine would eventually result in mathematical strangulation. He had to operate on interior lines. He needed to leverage the specific geography of the Rappahannock line to force an engagement on his terms, despite the numbers.
And Hooker's more than willing to initiate that engagement. On April 27th, he launches a turning movement that, architecturally speaking, is a masterpiece of grand tactical planning.
Truly a brilliant plan on paper.
Yeah. He decides to pin Lee at Fredericksburg while sending a massive strike force around the Confederate left flank.
The operational security and the logistical execution of this movement were phenomenal. Hooker takes 3 full infantry corps, the 5th Corps under Meade, the 11th Corps under Howard, and the 12th Corps under Slocum.
That's a lot of
Ton. He marches them aggressively upstream to the northwest, utilizing Kelly's Ford and Germanna Ford to cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan Rivers, and once across, they are reinforced by the 2nd Corps.
So this creates a highly mobile 70,000-man flanking wing moving rapidly into Lee's rear echelons.
Exactly.
While that flanking maneuver is underway, Hooker utilizes the concept of fixing the enemy. He leaves Major General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, which is huge, it's a massive formation of 23,000 men, along with the 1st Corps and cavalry detachments directly opposite Fredericksburg.
To keep Lee's attention.
Yeah, they're generating noise, pushing pickets and forcing Lee to maintain his defensive posture against what appears to be a renewed frontal assault.
It is the classic hammer and anvil strategy. Sedgwick is the anvil at Fredericksburg. The 70,000-man flanking wing is the hammer coming down from the northwest.
The objective being to sever Lee's vital supply lines, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, and just crush the Army of Northern Virginia between these two massive Union forces.
That was the goal. And by April 30th, the execution is flawless. The flanking force crosses the rivers and concentrates at a strategic crossroads dominated by a large brick tavern called the Chancellor House.
Hooker is elated at this point. I mean, he issues an order to his men that borders on sheer hubris. He says, "Our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle on our own ground where certain destruction awaits him."
Yeah, the fatal flaw in Hooker's calculation there was his definition of our own ground.
Right.
Because the Chancellorsville crossroads was situated squarely within the wilderness of Spotsylvania. This was roughly 70 square miles of impenetrable secondary growth forest.
The original old-growth timber had been clear-cut decades earlier, right, to fuel local iron furnaces.
Exactly. And what replaced it was a chaotic, dense jungle of scrub oak, pine, and thick, thorny underbrush.
The GIS terrain analysis in Mick Prichter's study heavily emphasizes this. In the wilderness, line of sight was frequently reduced to less than 50 feet. It created these massive acoustic shadows where atmospheric conditions and dense foliage could completely mask the sound of a raging firefight just a mile away.
Which fundamentally degrades command and control. You cannot maneuver Corps-sized elements if you cannot see them.
Or hear them.
Or hear them. More critically, this specific microterrain entirely negated the Union's two massive advantages. First, numerical superiority is useless if you are constrained to deploying troops in narrow columns along logging trails.
Right, you can't spread out.
You cannot leverage a 70,000-man force if the frontage only allows a single brigade to engage at a time. Second, it neutralized the Union artillery reserve.
Henry J. Hunt's 400 guns. They were practically useless.
Exactly. Artillery relies on clear fields of fire and observation. In the wilderness, cannons were basically blind. Shells would detonate prematurely against the dense timber. They'd spray wood splinters, sure, but they failed to achieve effective fragmentation against troop formations.
So Hooker had marched his technologically and numerically superior army into a massive topographical equalizer.
He really did.
But even recognizing that, Hooker's vanguard had actually reached the eastern edge of the wilderness. If they pushed just a few miles further east on April 30th, they break out into the open, rolling terrain toward Fredericksburg,
where they could deploy their artillery.
Yes, expand their battle lines, close the jaws of the trap. But Hooker issues an order that just halts the advance. He orders his corps commanders to entrench around the Chancellorsville crossroads and assume a defensive posture.
And that pause is the pivot point of the entire campaign. He voluntarily surrendered the operational momentum.
Why? I mean, what was he thinking?
Hooker's psychological transition from an aggressive, maneuver-oriented commander to a passive defender is still heavily debated. Whether it was a sudden failure of nerve or a genuine belief that his initial maneuver was so brilliant that Lee would be forced into a suicidal frontal assault against entrenched Union lines. The result was the same.
He ceded the initiative to Robert E. Lee. Imagine the frustration of his corps commanders. I mean, George Meade, commanding the Fifth Corps, is notoriously aggressive. He executes this grueling river crossing, secures the flank, and is then told to stop and dig dirt in a thicket.
Meade was livid. He understood that momentum is a finite resource. Once you halt a 70,000-man advance and tell them to dig in, shifting them back into an offensive posture through dense terrain is incredibly difficult.
He essentially locked himself in a box and handed Lee the key.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So, how does a commander like Lee exploit an enemy who has voluntarily surrendered their momentum? We move into May 1st. Through Stuart's aggressive cavalry screening, Lee confirms that the force in his rear isn't a diversion, it's the main Union body. A conventional commander facing this intelligence consolidates their forces to meet the primary threat.
But Lee assesses the geometry of the trap and realizes consolidation is a death sentence.
Right.
If he pulls entirely off the Fredericksburg line, Sedgwick will advance and take his rear. If he stays at Fredericksburg, Hooker eventually breaks out of the wilderness. Therefore, Lee violates the fundamental maxim of never dividing a smaller force in the face of a superior enemy.
He splits his army.
He leaves Major General Jubal Early with a holding force of just 12,000 men at Marye's Heights to check Sedgwick's 23,000. Lee then takes his remaining 40,000 troops and force marches them west on the Orange Turnpike, directly toward Hooker's entrenched 70,000.
On May 1st, Hooker finally attempts to push east again. His vanguard elements collide with Lee's advancing columns. The engagement is sharp, but the Union forces are actually holding their own. Yet the moment Hooker receives reports of heavy Confederate resistance, he orders a general withdrawal back to the Chancellorsville entrenchments.
Meade and Couch were absolutely furious about this. They had superior numbers and were on the verge of clearing the timber.
So why pull back?
Because Hooker's situational awareness was compromised. He was operating on the assumption that his flanking maneuver had forced Lee into a retreat. Finding Lee advancing aggressively completely shattered Hooker's cognitive model of the battle.
Oh, wow. So he panicked.
Basically, he retreated to the perceived safety of his earthworks, fully locking the Army of the Potomac into a static defense.
Which sets the stage for the legendary night council between Lee and Jackson on May 1st. They are positioned in the woods, facing a heavily fortified Union line that outnumbers them nearly 2-to-1. A frontal assault through the wilderness against earthworks would be suicide.
Absolutely. The intelligence breakthrough comes from J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry. Stuart's vedettes have scouted the extreme right flank of the Union Army, which is held by the 11th Corps.
And what do they find?
Stuart reports that this flank is in the air, meaning it is not anchored on a river, a swamp, or any defensible terrain feature. It is simply resting exposed in the dense woods along the Orange Turnpike.
So Lee makes a decision that just defies all mathematical logic. He has already divided his 60,000 men to leave 12,000 at Fredericksburg. Now he decides to divide his remaining 40,000.
Right. He leaves Major Generals Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson with a mere 10,000 men to maintain a noisy, active facade in front of Hooker's center and left.
Just to keep them occupied.
Exactly. Lee then assigns Jackson his entire Second Corps, roughly 30,000 infantry, and tasks him with executing a 12-mile sweeping flank march. They utilize obscure logging tracks like the Catherine Furnace Road to traverse entirely around the Union front and strike that exposed right flank.
Wait. If Hooker has balloon reconnaissance and signal stations, how do 30,000 men march across the front of his army undetected?
Well, they weren't undetected. That is the tragedy of the Union command failure on May 2nd.
They saw them.
Oh, yeah. Jackson's column, moving rapidly down the Catherine Furnace Road, kicked up massive dust clouds. Union observation posts spotted the dust. Union pickets even engaged Jackson's rearguard. The intelligence of a massive Confederate movement was continuously fed to Hooker's headquarters at the Chancellor House.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If Hooker is receiving confirmed reports of a Confederate column moving south and west across his front, why does he assume they are retreating toward Gordonsville? Why doesn't he recognize the flanking maneuver?
You have to look at the psychological inertia of Hooker's plan. He had written a script where his brilliant river crossing forced Lee to abandon Richmond.
He saw what he wanted to see.
Exactly. When intelligence arrived, Hooker aggressively filtered it to confirm his pre-existing bias. A column moving south and west fit the narrative of a retreat perfectly. He even dispatched a telegraph to Washington declaring the enemy was in full flight.
That is wild. So while Hooker is congratulating himself on a bloodless victory, Jackson's 30,000 men spend the entire day marching, eventually curling north to position themselves directly adjacent to the Union 11th Corps.
Commanded by Major General Oliver O. Howard, the 11th Corps was largely composed of German-American regiments who had faced heavy nativist prejudice within the Army.
But the failure here wasn't on the soldiers, right?
No, their failure here wasn't a lack of fighting spirit. It was a catastrophic failure of command deployment. Because Hooker had assured them the enemy was retreating, Howard did not refuse his flank. His men were aligned facing south toward the road, completely ignoring the deep timber to their west.
Right, so at 1730 hours on May 2nd, Jackson's corps is fully deployed in massed echelon formations hidden within the tree line. The Union soldiers are butchering cattle, they're boiling coffee, resting with their arms stacked. They're in a complete administrative posture.
They had no idea what was coming. When Jackson orders the advance, it is a localized apocalypse. 3 divisions commanded by Rhodes, Colston, and A.P. Hill just burst from the underbrush.
That must have been terrifying.
The acoustic shock alone of 30,000 men screaming the rebel yell and unleashing massed volleys into an unprepared camp is devastating. The 11th Corps doesn't just retreat, it disintegrates.
just shatters.
The structural integrity of the Corps shatters in under an hour, and the Confederate assault rolls eastward, collapsing the Union flank and driving them back nearly 2 miles in utter chaos.
The momentum is only stalled by the setting sun, the blinding darkness of the wilderness, and the total disorganization of the Confederate formations as units intermingle in the dense scrub.
Right. Night falls and it gets confusing.
But Jackson, operating on pure adrenaline and aggression, he refuses to halt. He wants to push through the night to cut off Hooker's retreat route at United States Ford.
Now, night combat in the Civil War was exceptionally rare and highly dangerous due to the inability to distinguish friend from foe. But Jackson rides forward of his own lines with his staff to scout the road network
In the dark.
in pitch black. As they return toward the Confederate positions, the tension among the Southern pickets is extreme. They know Union cavalry is operating in the area.
So a detachment from the 18th North Carolina Infantry hears the horses in the dark. Unable to identify the riders, they unleash a volley.
Stonewall Jackson is struck 3 times. The wounds are severe, necessitating the amputation of his left arm. The immediate tactical consequence is that command of the Second Corps is decapitated at the exact moment of their greatest success.
A huge blow.
Major General A.P. Hill assumes command and is almost immediately incapacitated by artillery fire himself. The command ultimately falls to J.E.B. Stuart.
A cavalryman now tasked with managing a massive infantry assault in the dark.
Yeah, not ideal.
But the long-term consequence of that friendly fire volley is immeasurable. When Lee receives the dispatch regarding the amputation, his response perfectly encapsulates their symbiotic command relationship. He says, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right."
It was the severing of the operational nerve center of the Army of Northern Virginia. Jackson possessed a unique capacity to interpret Lee's broad strategic intent and execute it with an independent ferocity that no other Confederate subordinate could ever match.
This thrusts us into May 3rd, 1863, the cauldron of the wilderness. Jackson is gone, but Stuart renews the assault at dawn. And the battle now pivots on a specific piece of micro-terrain that Mick Prichter's GIS analysis proves was the tactical key to the entire Chancellorsville Plateau: Hazel Grove.
Right, Hazel Grove was a slight elevation, just a cleared plateau south of the Chancellor House. On the night of May 2nd, Major General Daniel Sickles' Third Corps held this high ground, heavily supported by artillery.
It was a great defensive spot.
Oh, from a defensive standpoint, it anchored the Union line and prevented the 2 wings of Lee's divided Army Stuart in the west and Lee with Anderson in the east from linking up.
But Hooker, continuing his pattern of inexplicable defensive contraction, orders Sickles to abandon Hazel Grove before dawn and pull back to a tighter perimeter around the crossroads.
It is arguably the single greatest tactical error of the campaign. The moment Sickles vacates that elevation, J.E.B. Stuart seizes it. The Confederate artillery chief, Colonel E. Porter Alexander, immediately recognizes the geometric dominance of the position. He rushes dozens of artillery pieces onto the Hazel Grove Plateau.
Okay, explain the specific geometry here for me. Why does a slight rise in a forest matter so much?
Because it provided clear, unobstructed lines of sight directly down the length of the Union defensive positions anchoring the Chancellor House. Alexander's guns were able to achieve enfilading fire.
Meaning they were firing down the long axis of the trenches.
Exactly. They were firing down the long axis of the Union trenches, meaning a single projectile could tear through the entire depth of a formation rather than just hitting the front rank. It converted the Union center into an absolutely untenable kill zone.
And under this massive artillery barrage, Hooker's headquarters at the Chancellor House is just being torn apart. Around 0930 hours, Hooker is standing on the porch, leaning against a large wooden pillar, and a Confederate solid shot strikes the pillar.
The kinetic energy transfer is massive. The pillar splits, and Hooker is violently thrown to the deck, knocked unconscious.
Wow.
In the medical context of the 1860s, they lacked the diagnostic language for traumatic brain injury, but Hooker definitely suffered a severe concussion.
And the scene is sheer bedlam. I mean, the tavern is ablaze, staff officers are scrambling, the civilian Chancellor family is sheltering in the cellar, and the commander of the Army of the Potomac is incapacitated.
It's a complete mess.
When Hooker regains consciousness, he is visibly disoriented. His second-in-command, Darius Couch, urges him to transfer authority, but Hooker refuses.
Operating under the fog of a severe concussion, Hooker's decision-making just collapses entirely. He orders a general withdrawal from the vital Chancellorsville crossroads, pulling his massive army back into a tight U-shaped defensive perimeter anchored on the rivers.
He essentially concedes the battlefield to Lee.
He does.
But while Hooker is retreating, the anvil finally strikes. Back at Fredericksburg, Major General John Sedgwick launches his 23,000 men against Jubal Early's thinly held lines at Marye's Heights.
Sedgwick utilizes massed infantry assaults and successfully breaches the Stonewall, shattering the Confederate defense. Early retreats southward, and Sedgwick immediately pivots west, force-marching his corps down the Orange Plank Road toward Lee's exposed rear.
Lee is now caught between Hooker's massive entrenched force to his north and Sedgwick's advancing corps to his east. I mean, if Hooker launches a coordinated breakout, Lee's army ceases to exist.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Lee's mastery of operational tempo dictates the outcome. He reads the total paralysis in Hooker's posture.
He knows Hooker won't move.
Right. Lee leaves Stuart to screen Hooker's entire army with a fraction of his force and aggressively peels off Lafayette McLaws' division, turning them east to intercept Sedgwick.
And McLaws collides with Sedgwick's vanguard at Salem Church. It's a stout brick structure situated on a slate ridge. The fighting there on the afternoon of May 3rd is incredibly vicious, but McLaws successfully bottlenecks Sedgwick's advance.
We really must pause to quantify the violence of May 3rd. Between the artillery duel at Hazel Grove, the brutal infantry fighting around the Chancellor House, the storming of Marye's Heights, and the collision at Salem Church, this single day produced over 21,000 casualties.
Unbelievable.
It stands as the second bloodiest day of the entire American Civil War. The woods caught fire from the artillery, and countless wounded men who could not be evacuated burned to death in the underbrush.
God, that's horrific. Which leads us to the final phase, May 4th through the 6th. Hooker is sitting in his defensive perimeter with nearly 80,000 troops who have hardly fired a weapon. Meade and Reynolds are practically demanding to be unleashed. They know Lee is distracted by Sedgwick.
But Hooker refuses. A counterattack by the 5th and 1st Corps would have crushed Stuart's screening force and rolled up Lee's army entirely. But Hooker's nerve is utterly broken. He refuses to authorize an offensive.
So Lee realizes Hooker is out of the fight.
Exactly. Lee, recognizing that Hooker is permanently neutralized, leaves a skeletal force facing the Union earthworks and concentrates overwhelming combat power against Sedgwick near Banks Ford.
And Sedgwick realizes he is isolated, he's outnumbered, and he's receiving zero support from Hooker. So under the cover of darkness on May 4th and 5th, he executes a brilliant tactical withdrawal, extracting his corps across the Rappahannock.
With Sedgwick neutralized, Lee turns his entire army back west, intending to launch a final, decisive assault against Hooker's entrenchments. But torrential rains begin on May 5th, turning the wilderness into a quagmire and swelling the rivers, which threatens Hooker's pontoon bridges.
Fearing his army will be trapped against a flooding river, Hooker convenes a council of war. And despite the majority of his corps commanders voting to hold their ground and fight, Hooker unilaterally orders a full retreat.
Just packs it in.
Overnight, on May 5th and 6th, the Army of the Potomac slinks back across the United States ford in the freezing rain.
And by dawn on May 6th, Lee rides into the Chancellorsville clearing victorious. He had repelled an army more than twice his size, but the tactical brilliance masks a strategic hemorrhage.
The casualties were immense, weren't they?
The Confederate Army suffered 13,000 casualties. That's roughly 22% of their total effective strength.
The Union suffered roughly 17,000. But when we analyze the demographics and industrial capacity of the two nations, that exchange rate is catastrophic for the South. The North can replace 17,000 men. Lee cannot replace his hardened veterans.
It was a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. Yes, Lee protected Richmond and humiliated Hooker, but he degraded the operational capacity of the Army of Northern Virginia permanently.
So what does this all mean for the legacy of the campaign? I mean, when Lincoln receives a telegraph confirming the retreat, he cases his office in despair, famously stating, "My God, what will the country say?"
Hooker's reputation is irreparably damaged. He's relieved of command just days before the Battle of Gettysburg, replaced by George Meade.
And what about the Confederates? I know the strategic ripple effect of Chancellorsville extends directly into Pennsylvania. Jackson succumbs to pneumonia on May 10th.
Which forces Lee to reorganize his army into 3 corps, promoting generals like Richard Ewell and E.P. Hill. But when Lee demands aggressive, discretionary execution at Gettysburg 2 months later, his new corps commanders hesitate. They do not possess Jackson's operational tempo.
Furthermore, does the sheer improbability of the victory at Chancellorsville infect Lee with a fatal hubris?
Undoubtedly. Lee witnessed his starving, exhausted infantry achieve the impossible against superior numbers. He internalized a belief in the absolute invincibility of his men.
That's dangerous.
Very. That psychological conditioning directly contributed to his willingness to order catastrophic frontal assaults, such as Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. He believed his infantry could overcome any tactical disadvantage.
The cultural impact is equally profound. Stephen Crane utilized the specific psychological horror of the wilderness to frame his 1895 novel, The Red Badge of Courage.
Oh, it completely shifted military literature.
Right. Away from grand, sweeping heroism and focused on the isolating, chaotic terror of the individual soldier lost in the woods. Additionally, Jackson's death became the foundational pillar of the lost cause ideology.
It allowed Southern apologists to argue they were defeated by fate and the loss of their martial genius, rather than by Northern industrial and logistical superiority.
For those studying the campaign today, the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park offers an unparalleled opportunity to study the dictation of terrain over tactics. You can visit the visitor center, and they provide the deep historical context and the exact GIS mappings that Mick Richter utilized.
It's an incredible place to visit. You can stand on the physical footprint of the Chancellor House and observe the sightlines.
But the most vital experience is standing on the plateau at Hazel Grove, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. When you view the elevation and look down toward the Union positions, the geometric necessity of holding that ground becomes instantly, viscerally clear.
You can walk the Catherine Furnace Trail, tracing the exact 12-mile route of Jackson's flanking column, and experience the oppressive density of the second-growth timber for yourself. You can view the profound battle scarring still etched into the brickwork of Salem Church.
It is a landscape that demands physical presence to truly understand the friction of 19th century combat.
As we conclude this analysis, there is a counterfactual scenario that perfectly encapsulates the fragility of history. On the morning of May 3rd, that 12-pound solid shot struck the wooden pillar Hooker was leaning against. The concussive force paralyzed the command structure of the Army of the Potomac. But what if that artillery crew had cut their fuse a fraction of a second differently?
It's a haunting question.
What if that iron sphere had deviated 3 feet to the left, missing the pillar and burying itself harmlessly in the mud?
It forces us to ask, if Joseph Hooker had remained physically uninjured and mentally lucid, would his inherent aggression have resurfaced? Would he have authorized Meade and Reynolds to unleash 80,000 fresh troops against a battered, disorganized, and heavily outnumbered Confederate army?
Could a fully lucid Hooker have broken the Army of Northern Virginia right there in the wilderness of Spotsylvania? Could the Battle of Chancellorsville, celebrated as Lee's tactical masterpiece, have instead been the engagement that ended the American Civil War 2 full years early?
It is a staggering reality that the geopolitical fate of a nation may have hinged entirely on the ballistic trajectory of a single piece of iron.
We want to remind you that the depth of this analysis was made possible entirely by the rigorous research of Mick Richter. To explore the primary source documents, view the advanced GIS terrain models, and access hundreds of other comprehensive battle and campaign studies, you absolutely must visit battlefieldtravels.com. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.